Alright, I wanted to do some streaming stuff. I plan to do a world building podcast where I build settings for D&D first, where I build settings for D&D while interacting with a live chat. But for right now, I wanted to start with something simpler. So we're going to be reacting to terrible writing advice videos with the dungeon master perspective in mind, because Dungeons and Dragons and terrible writing advice, it's a very weird, because once you're watching something from the perspective of I'm dungeon master, how can I use this for D&D, it changes how stuff works. Also, I just like watching terrible writing advice. This is also going to be kind of EFAP format. That is every frame of pause. It's a great podcast. I would recommend it. Where I'm going to basically watch it and pause and then add commentary. And I have a little preview of my stream and my hands are going everywhere. I'm sorry about that. All right.
Government. Real world dictator.
Sorry, that was my experimentation.
Do you want to write a dystopian novel? Great! By following my expert advice, you too can usher in a gritty dark future of unending human horror and suffering.
Okay, so I don't see a lot of RPGs with a dystopian end. I read one once, but it was but it was kind of garbage. That said, I do like the concept of running some more dystopian RPGs. I recall one guy I talk with doing a lot of cyberpunk, but I digress, sorry.
It's that easy. Let's get started. So the first thing any dystopia needs is an evil, oppressive government.
So I do like evil oppressive governments for my games. You have to be careful about how you balance them, because the problem is an evil oppressive government works great for like a novel and stuff, but once you have it in the RPG, it needs to be something that can be feasibly toppled.
World dictatorships come about as a result of a lot of socioeconomic factors, but no one has time for that pesky research thing. So let's just say that some vague past disaster made everything terrible. Hate a particular ideology? Make a straw man version of it and blow it way out of proportion. Genius! I bet no one has thought of that before. Need inspiration? Why bother reading a history book about real fascist regimes when we can just model our dystopian society after high school?
Uh, okay, so how the regime comes into power, if you're running a D&D game, that can be important, but also it's not a big deal if you keep it vague. So a lot of things that you'll notice is whatever really matters and is relevant whenever you're writing like a novel isn't often quite as impactful whenever you're doing a D&D game, because for the D&D game the objective is play game, while for the novel the objective is make a believable story. So I'm perfectly fine with having the evil regime of my Dungeons and Dragons game being how it got there being a little vague. If we do want to justify it, generally speaking, you can do something like royalty moving down or some other variety of corruption taking over, sometimes with magic and power and whatnot.
Actually, why even waste time with that? Is building a believable and convincing setting really necessary? Of course not.
Like I said. World building does involve a lot of trying to make it believable and convincing. The exact degree varies wildly.
That's time better spent on setting up a love triangle for the protagonist. So now we
That's gonna be the first love triangle. It's gonna keep coming.
have an evil government without any logical reason for existing, and a setting completely lacking in detail. But we are not done yet. Now we need some villains. Don't worry, villains are easy, so long as we don't waste time characterizing them. Short on time? Use a classic evil dystopian overlord. Remember to make him vague and mysterious to avoid actually having to flesh out his character.
That can still be very impactful. Avatar The Last Airbender, the Overlord was very vague. You just needed, like, the locations where he does stuff to be very impactful. So, you don't learn a lot about the Overlord in Avatar, but in Avatar, you do meet people directly related to him, that is his children, and that's where most of the characterization of him comes from.
Be sure to give him a highly trained but strangely incompetent elite military police force that constantly fails to capture a bunch of plucky teenagers. Speaking of villains, make sure...
See, I do have a problem with having, like, incompetence be how the heroes get away. You ideally want, like, competent heroes doing clever things to escape situations. And you can get that a lot in D&D because I can kill you, and then the heroes need to figure out how to not have that happen.
all of the smart people are evil. We want to teach future generations the dangers of science, intellectualism, and free thought. We don't want our dystopian novel to actually be about thinking for yourself after all. That would be double plus ungood. Now that we have our villains...
Double plus ungood. Is that a reference to 1984? Ha! Sorry, I just noticed the language. I googled it real quick. I don't know how that turned out on the stream, but I noticed the language sounded like the short speak or whatever it was called.
We need our protagonist. We could have our protagonist be an ordinary person who chooses to rebel against an oppressive system they've previously been complacent in, proving that even average people can change a corrupt world. But that would be stupid. No, we need...
Lord of the Rings had the main characters be the hobbits, which were meant to represent the average person, and that was always a very impactful thing. You can do that a lot in D&D too. What you do is you make your character someone who was an average person but then chose to become a hero, and you can do some different aspects and thinking and whatnot.
Need our protagonist to be a teenage girl who is a special snowflake. Don't actually make her pretty, though. Describe her as ordinary in appearance, while every attractive male character falls madly in love with her at first sight. Never actually have her work for anything. Make sure she effortlessly succeeds at whatever she tries with only minimal training.
Is this Ray? I'm sorry, sequel trilogy was bad.
Are there any adults around? If they are, then make sure they are completely useless, or even actively working against the protagonist. If the protagonist has parents, make sure they too are worthless, or dead. We can't have reasonable people resolving our plot after all. Speaking of plot, many would assume that dystopian fiction is a cautionary tale about failed societies and a grim commentary on the human condition, but that is completely wrong.
So how grim you want to make it can vary a lot. What I would do for a dystopian is I'd have a lot of the government collapse, and then you have the remaining people starting to band together, and you get your tribe formats to avoid the making it too grim, because it's like, oh yeah, sure, everything can fall apart, but then it can pick up again.
Dystopia is all about love triangles. Make sure the protagonist has to choose between not one, but two hunky guys. Oh, the drama. How cruel is fate when one must choose between two awesome things. What a harsh world our protagonist must endure. But hang in there, we are almost done. Although the love triangle will take up most of the plot, some time must be spent sorting out that whole evil dystopian government thing. Naturally, our protagonist will be the one who leads the charge. Even though the dystopian government has legions of professional soldiers, absolute control over all of its citizens, and a willingness to do anything to achieve victory, they will prove completely ineffective at stopping a single teenager.
So generally speaking, you want like an army to overthrow. This would be like large portions of people all banding together against the dystopian empire. In D&D, it's a lot harder to do that because you need the protagonist as the players to do stuff. Generally speaking, this will come down to finding people to help you overthrow them. I remember I did a plot once where the enemy was like an orcish army, and the players had to go find themselves allies to attack the orcish army. And what I did for that was I sent them to I sent them to try and gather like a monk temple to help them. And then when they came back, we then had the final battle where it was like they fought the leaders of the orcs while there was a big battle going on in the background within the battle. Lots of battling.
Once the dystopia is toppled and its citizens freed, make sure to spend the remaining time detailing the conclusion of the protagonist's love life and not on the huge power vacuum and rebel infighting that would surely occur after the fall of a central political system.
Rebel infighting. Now that does sound kind of fun. You take over. Like if you had a plot where the players take over, and then itchy head. If you had a plot where the players take over and then it immediately has to deal with infighting, that could be a very fun plot.
After all, classic dystopian novels are known for their happy endings. Now we have everything we need to make an awesome romance, dystopian story. Good luck, and may the words ever be in your favor while you create a brave new world. Well, at least until the government decides to burn all the books. But that's okay. You will probably get a movie deal before that. One thing every story needs is a protagonist.
So, since we're doing this from the context of D&D, this actually changes a lot because now you have the player characters. Now, the thing about player characters is they do things, and that, is you don't get control over them. So this would be, we're looking at from the perspective of we're making a character for a game.
But what kind of protagonist, one might ask? Why a perfect one, of course.
Okay, you can never reach perfection normally because the games are inbuilt with a flaw system. But you do want a good you want someone that's capable of getting things done, and that's something people miss a lot whenever they go for the imperfect character. They need to still have capabilities. Whenever you have a character that's bad at everything, they're just annoying and you don't really want to root for them quite the same. What you need is someone who can get stuff done and then fails at critical points, and that's where you can have teamwork building between the things.
Let's get started. At first, creating the perfect protagonist may seem like a daunting task, but don't worry. Let's just start with a name. We will call our protagonist, Mary Sue. See? We are already halfway done.
The halfway done. It's a good joke. I do that a lot with D&D characters. It's like here's my main character, or not my main character. Here's my character. Here's his name. Okay, we're halfway done with his characterization, and then I build the character sheet. And I'm like, all right, he's good. You know, the exact amount of backstory varies a lot. I'll normally have like a paragraph of flavor text, like, oh, he's paranoid or whatever. But I try not to overthink the character building. I end up kind of making the character make more sense in roleplay.
Utterly lacking in self-awareness? Perfect. They say write what you know, and almost everyone knows themselves better than anyone else. So just put yourself into the story. Some might worry that they will make for a poor protagonist. Fear not. That's just because we need to get rid of the one thing that makes...
Okay, I'm perfectly fine with cheap protagonists. Lazy protagonists actually suck a lot of the time. They're just not fun. Because you really want them to have a level of initiative going on. And if the second they aren't in combat, their immediate move is to go lay down, it kind of isn't quite as enjoyable.
Makes audiences not identify with the character. Flaws. Yes, just scrub all of your flaws away and make your protagonist an idealized version of yourself. Now that we removed all flaws, let's start adding strengths. Let's make Mary Sue young, if not immortal, because she's a half-dragon, half-vampire, half-angel, half-elven princess. Always have everyone...
Okay, I really hate the half and halves in D&D. Like your half-elf is fine, your half-orc is fine. But, like, the more you do it, the less unique it feels like. So you get the half dwarf or whatever someone might do. It's like, really, man? And it just keeps getting more and more kind of silly the longer you set up the half species.
Else describe her as beautiful, while she remains completely unaware of her own gorgeous looks. Have her be so attractive that guys literally fight over her, but make sure Mary Sue is never actually smart enough to figure out why. That would make her look vain, which is a flaw. Now, some of you might believe that flaws make characters believable and are a useful tool for humanizing our protagonist. That means if we must give Mary Sue flaws, then we should give her things like she cares too much, or she's too kind and selfless. We can even have her die.
Okay, so I'm going to make a note here. The Game of Thrones, I never watched the show, but I read the books. The first one has the character actually have a flaw of he's too honorable, and his honor leads to his death. And that's a big deal within the story, and I could rattle on about for a bit. But there are cases of honor or whatnot being used as a flaw in interesting ways. It's kind of like how I like to see paladins. You don't want to overdo them, but having the oath act as a partial drawback can be a very engaging character.
Die tragically at the end of the story and say that she was simply too good for this sinful earth. It's okay. We can always resurrect her later if we need to add some drama.
I hate resurrection. I hate it in storytelling. It works fine in D&D because we can at least tie a cost to it, you need to do this, or this, and then you can also have different traps be unresurrectable. But it really does get annoying sometimes. Also, if you ever want to stop your characters from resurrecting one another, you can do this through either limiting their gold income, which I have a tendency to run low gold anyways, or you can do this through it's gold income, or you can actually kill them in ways that can't be resurrected. Beheadings are great. Beheadings work most of the time until you get to high level magic. Disintegrations also work. Wise about it, but generally speaking, it's a good move to do some steps to prevent everything from becoming a, oh, here's my diamond. Unless you run a low death campaign, in which case you can forget all that completely.
We could always give her a tragic backstory that she constantly angst about, but never actually affects her outside of getting her pity points with the other characters.
Make Mary Sue a rogue. I kind of like that. You get the perfect character, but then it's a rogue. Let me think. Give me a second. I'm gonna pull something up. Take a moment. Bloop. Bloop. See. This is the this is a AI art program. I use it for the videos. Let's do Mary Sue Rogue HD 4K. I just want to see what this looks like. Maybe do that. Am I misspelling rogue? Nope, that's right. Here we can whoop, wrong I am. Get the there you go. Oops, I ran it on the wrong program. Y'all can't see that. I have a second tab open that I tried to run it on. Is it not running? Let's see. Do the thing. They close that and do the thing. What's going on here? Okay, so I put in Mary Sue dressed as a rogue 4K HD. Let's see if we can get an interesting looking character. Oh, I should have let me think. Fantasy art. This might take a few minutes. I really do like my AI art. Very fun stuff. It just isn't instant. Yeah. All the buttons. Okay, we can continue the video while that's cooking.
But before that, we need to make sure that everyone knows Mary Sue is special. Have a prophecy in the story? Make sure it's all about her. Is Mary Sue not in the scene? Have every other character there talk about her. Shifting focus to the villains? Make sure they don't waste time actually running their evil empire or otherwise bringing their dark desires to...
So, you don't see the villains a lot in D&D? Well, you see them, but if you have someone running like an evil empire for the purposes of this statement, you don't get to see what they're up to. The players don't, but you, the DM, can think about it. I generally like to think that they do take a personal interest in the players, mostly because of their heroic nature, and it can be very notable. Why is that not working? No, it's still loading. What's going on here? Sorry. And it was at the wrong position too. That's very upsetting. Alright. Check on this one last time. That's horrible. Okay, let's try that again.
fruition. Instead, they should be worrying about what Mary Sue is doing or plotting to take her for themselves. Does Mary Sue have parents? Make sure they are either outrageously abusive or perfect except for being tragically dead, or both. Have her real special parents killed in the backstory while she is stuck with abusive normal foster parents. If they are abusive, make sure they inflict terrible atrocities upon her, like forcing her to wear dresses or attending school to better her education. Need to make a clear distinction between good and evil characters? Mary Sue makes it easy.
So the clear distinction in Dungeons and Dragons is kind of rough. Generally speaking, you need to show why this character is evil. I think the best way to do that is to have have them do something in front of the players. Normally, you're kick the dog scene, but not actually kicking a dog. I don't like the players ever not being the heroes of the story, so I really wouldn't recommend trying to set them up as the bad guys, but you can get some entries.
If a character disagrees with her, then they are most certainly a bad guy, while all those who agree with her are 100% virtuous without fail. This removes any character who could call out Mary Sue for her mistakes, which she never makes, so it isn't needed.
You might consider a character to actually say, hey, are you sure you want to do that? Oh, yeah, AI art isn't consistent. That's kinda okay, but definitely not that good. Maybe we just need a... Maybe that'll do it.
One thing to watch out for is to ensure that Mary Sue never fails. Have her effortlessly overcome every challenge.
So that's something that can be very difficult to manage in D&D. You don't want the main characters to effortlessly overcome every challenge. And it can often be a little difficult getting that right strength of balance and struggle or whatnot. I find often especially if you're running 5e, I wouldn't recommend 5e for a lot of people, because the individual combat encounter is really low if you're running it challenge rating as intended. because you're supposed to do a bunch of combats, but I find most people don't run all of the combats, and that is generally speaking a mistake. Because often they run their combat and then combat and then combat and then combat, and that's when you get to the point where it's good. But whenever you aren't running the combats as they're intended, what you end up with is you end up with a very low challenge setting, or a low challenge game, or you end up making those individual combats very deadly, which is a big mistake because then it becomes run or fight. It doesn't really matter. What I'm trying to say is 1 or 2 combats when you're trying to run 5e really bad. Oh, there we go. There we go. Here is Mary Sue as a rogue. Took a minute. What's with the hair? The hair's so dumb. The hair is so dumb. Oh, maybe that's why she's special. Maybe the hair gives her superpowers or something. I don't know.
Make sure she bests all veteran characters in setting in spite of having only a fraction of the experience. Are the villains ruthless and supremely powerful? Not compared to Mary Sue. They should crumble before her in the most anticlimactic way possible.
There was a... what's the words? Hard to get sometimes. I've seen some battles that I wanted to be very exciting end up being like a slog. Like once I did this battle, and I was really looking forward to the battle, and it was like they fought like a drow priest or something, and then they were in a building, and then in the middle of the battle they have their pet like destroy a window, and then light comes in, and it's supposed to be real exciting, and then the villains just end up being like a hit point sponge. So what would have been a really cool combat like dragged out for like 2 or 3 hours, and it was horrible. Still a fun session. It's just the hit points were too high.
Just like the story's narrative stakes. It's not like our readers actually want to see a close con.
So what's fun about D&D is you have more stakes than everything else. If you fail, you die. And that's where the stakes are derived from. You can set up more stakes in a D&D game than you can set up in all of a TV show, because the rules are 100% consistent, at least in theory. Stupid homebrew. Not all homebrew stupid, but ideally the rules are 100% consistent, and the stakes are always the players can die. That's what makes it fun. Let's shoot another one of those.
Test. If any villain ever manages to actually hurt Mary Sue or any of her friends, make sure she dishes out 100-fold more than she receives.
Players will do this a lot.
Ensure that she makes the villain suffer far more than she did, and that she shows him no remorse. After all, we don't want Mary Sue to display unheroic traits like mercy or forgiveness.
Yeah. That's a problem a lot that's a player thing, basically, since it's not real people. You don't normally display those traits. It can be really fun to see when they do. I remember there was a character, there was a campaign I did where they captured a drow, and they probably should have executed the drow, but they ended up showing the level of mercy and just imprisoning her and taking her back to the city or whatever. It was very interesting. But you don't see that a ton. I see lots of killing. There's one time that one of the players was like, "Alright, we won't kill you, tell us what's going on." Or he was like, "I won't kill you, tell us what's going on." And then after they got the information, a different player's like, "I made no such promise," and stabbed him.
Is Mary Sue starting to look a lot like the villain she is fighting? We could use their similarities to show Mary Sue's flaws while highlighting the positive traits of the villain to showcase the story's deep themes about the razor-edge difference between heroes and villains, adding a layer of depth to both the story.
Okay, you don't need that much depth for a D&D game. You can have it. It can be fun, but generally speaking, it's better to keep the plot fairly simple. so then you just have fun. Not that it can't be fun to have the depth. It's often wise to keep the plot simple because it can be more enjoyable within the setting. No. Let me find my words. It is often ideal to keep the plot simple because the players aren't normally following the plot that closely. So with a simple plot, you have a simple objective, and then you're just having fun on the way to that objective.
Story's symbolism and characterization. But that's dumb. We don't want the audience to actually think about depressing stuff like that. Thankfully, this is easy to fix. Simply make the villain even more despicable for extra contrast.
There was a show. It was the Inhumans TV show. Horrible show. Would not recommend it. Where they had it was like a Marvel show that was apparently built on like a contractual obligation, and the main character honestly was perfectly reasonable. He wasn't particularly evil throughout most of the show, and whenever he did act evil, it felt very out of place, and it all coalesced in the final like battle where he's just kinda stupid in the setup for it, because that helped him be more evil. Oh, new rogue. Kinda, It always gets the faces bad. Anyways.
That should stop the audience from rooting for him. Now we have the perfect protagonist for our story. Good luck, and may your story be too good for this sinful earth. Wait. I don't think this will work. My self-insert should be a guy. There, I'll call him Marty Stew. Want to make a fantasy world? Great! The magic and mystery are at your command while shaping a fantastic world full of exotic wonders. Yet who will live in this marvelous fantasy world? Why, we need to make some fantasy races.
Perfectly reasonable. What was I gonna say? I was gonna say there's often... I forgot what I was gonna say.
But there's so many wonderful fantasy races and numerous stories across many different mediums. How do we stand out from the crowd? By ripping off J.R.R. Tolkien, of course. Now some of...
Okay, so that's what I was gonna comment on. So the fantasy races have a tendency to rip off Tolkien. I find that's often... Like, you can get... Like, I like my dwarves, I like my elves, but you can get some really cool concepts, like, Here, let me pull it up to show it. See, can y'all see that? No, y'all cannot. Okay, so I'm a big fan of that Sinome race I made right there. That's like I took prairie dogs and I made them a race, and because prairie dogs have a very unique like culture and interaction with each other, I found it very fun. The thing is, you don't get that stuff whenever you what's the word? You don't get the coolness of that stuff a lot of the time. You see a lot of people don't make them interesting enough. I also remember there was a series of books I read, Artemis Fowl, where they did some really fun stuff with the different races. So their dwarves could they ate dirt and absorbed the nutrients out of it, and they could basically swim through the earth. And then it had all sorts of extra details, like if they pulled a hair, it would harden, and he could use it as a lockpick, and the dwarf character could use it as a lockpick. They had all these details, and it was very interesting. And you find that you don't see that quite enough in and sometimes you don't see these interesting concepts enough in your in mediums, because what they end up doing is they end up making just the fantasy races again. Like, they have one of my favorite versions of goblins. What they did was they made the goblins like reptilian, and then the goblins could conjure fire, which is part of how they were able to which was part of how they were able to deal with the cold-blooded nature of being reptilian goblins. And then they also put the dwarves in that same story as terrified as of fire as the perfect as a counterbalance to make the main characters really fear goblins. They also did elves very interesting. Artemis Fowl, great book series. Very unique fantasy races. Wrong button. There we go. Now that's out of the way.
You may think that the genre of fantasy is an excuse to free one's imagination to create truly alien and bizarre races, but that is utterly wrong. Fantasy is all about being derivative and not getting out of your comfort zone.
You can get some cool stuff if you like fully stretch out of the derivative nature. I don't know if it was any way derivative, but Full Metal Alchemist, like completely different vibe of fantasy that I always liked.
It is very important that the genre of fantasy remain sternly under the shadow of Tolkien and make no attempts to push the boundaries in any way. We do.
Yeah. Don't use gnomes. They aren't from Tolkien. I think that's why gnomes are so unpopular. I really like gnomes. Weird bit. Second edition gnomes had a specific like thing. Like they could not play wizard unless it was the illusionist wizard. They could take that wizard class specifically, but none of the others. I found it very funny. Second edition's cool. I would recommend reading it.
Do this by copying Tolkien's fantasy races while making sure to completely miss the point of Tolkien's themes. And, of course,
hobbits have a tendency to have them be heroic. That they were supposed to represent the everyman, and then you had and now they're just kind of these lucky short dudes that are there because Tolkien had them.
Never should we actually bother to read the original mythologies that inspired Tolkien to create his works. No one uses.
You don't need to read that, but you can do cool research and you can find all sorts of interesting stuff. I really recommend any dungeon master watch nature documentaries because there you can get some weird ideas that you can start mixing into different things.
Primary sources who wants to be taken seriously, just copy and paste. Let's get started. The first race we want to add into our fantasy world is elves. Tolkien's elves had a sordid and violent past. However, we have only watched the movies, so let's make our elves just like that. Ethereal, beautiful, and impossibly smug. In fact...
Okay, I don't see elves like that very often. I see elves get forgotten a lot. It's like, oh, well, he's an elf. What makes him different from humans? And, something. I remember that there was the Dragon Age TV show, I think it was. Bad show, would not recommend it, but they had the elves be, like, enslaved or something. And that was a very interesting take on elves. I generally, what I do is I put elves as, like, they have the long-standing empires, but they don't really have much of a population, so they aren't actually willing to risk war for expansion. So they end up with these tiny slivers of land where they just hang out and hope the humans don't attack them. Because if they have to go into war, they lose population that could take them centuries to recover, while humans take maybe a century to double their population from when the war started. Additionally, I need to rewatch Lord of the Rings.
We can apply many of the lessons of making a perfect protagonist to the elves. Make sure they are flawless in every way. I'm sure their ageless wisdom will come across as endearing rather than condescending. Be sure they use their heritage as an excuse to lord over the other races.
So that image right there is something I see people sometimes do with elves. I never really liked that version of elves. I do think part of the point of elves is like the ethereal nature, the long lives and whatnot, and there's a tendency to not do enough of that.
I can't see any historical parallels at all. So now that we have our eternal and perfect elves, what do we do next? Why, we add more of them. If readers like one race of smug, pretentious, and lecturing immortals who are always right, then they will love to have a whole bunch more. Want to preach about environmentalism? Use wood elves and make them tree-hugging hippies. Want to make your elves edgy? Send them through a goth phase and add dark elves. Why stop there? Keep adding new elven races.
So that's a big flaw with D&D. At least 5e. Like, I recommend playing other systems, but since most people play 5e, you read 5e. There's a lot of elves, which is kind of a problem. I like the drow. The drow have fun aspects to them. High elf and forest elf, not a huge differentiation. You know, think of it like hill and mountain dwarves, not a big deal. But then you start getting stuff like sea elves, and you just keep going, and at a certain point it just gets silly, which he's pointing out right here.
Until there isn't any room, or until we run out of ideas. Speaking of running out of ideas, dwarves are the easiest fantasy race. Just copy them directly from Tolkien without changing a single trait.
You can mess with the dwarvish traits. But you don't have to. Dwarves are perfect.
We may need to give them a Scottish accent to save time rather than creating a whole distinctive language.
I don't know why they have the Scottish accents. I played a dwarf cleric once. It was fantastic. What I tried to do with dwarves is I make them like a fairly religious race. So you have, they live something like 300 years, so they live longer than humans, less than elves. But I think since they're so like grounded in tradition, it makes sense to incorporate the deity, the religion of the setting into dwarves, which is why I tend to play a lot of dwarf clerics.
Need a source of steampunk technology? Dwarves will be the go-to origin of any mechanical.
So I did something like this once. I wanted to add steampunk technology into a setting I wrote, and I had it done by gnomes instead of dwarves. It was like rock gnomes or something. And I looked back at it fairly recently, not that recently, but I looked back at it after I made it. I found that the steampunk technology felt very out of place within the setting, and that's just a thing that happens sometimes. I threw it in as like a kitchen sink measure, but it ended up just not fitting. Yeah. So I wasn't very happy with that in post. So you can do this with dwarves, but I really wouldn't recommend it. I would have dwarves be like an enchanting group, because enchanting works a lot better while sticking to the setting mesh, if that makes sense.
Devices within the setting, but don't bother to explain why they haven't used their technological edge to conquer all of the other races.
I would like to see dwarf conquerors one day, but maybe they are. Maybe they just conquered the entire cave systems, and then they just don't care enough about the surface. Or maybe they're held back by constant wars with the Underdark, so they don't have the time to take over the surface world.
Make sure they stay within their underground halls, not having anything to do with the plot. But don't leave them out either. We can't deviate from the theme of ripping off Tolkien. Next,
You could cut dwarves entirely from a lot of settings without too much of a problem. That's more of a problem on the world building end. You gotta come up with what makes them interesting.
we will add in orcs. Remember to make the orcs' nature fundamentally evil. Some may find the moral and philosophical implications of a race that is inherently evil to be rather problematic, as it brings up deep questions about.
So, what I do is when I have the evil races and then I have the good races, I have the evil races made by evil deities. Because it is polytheistic, because it's Dungeons and Dragons. What you can do is you can have... what I do is I have the good race make the good race, and then the good race gives them free will, because why would I not give you free will? I'm a good guy, because I do consider the granting of free will to be an inherently good action. And then I have the evil races get made, and then they just weren't given the free will that they needed to begin with. So they will never be able to become good without, say, divine intervention or something. Uh, but generally speaking, they are, if there's an evil race, they are enacting the will of their god. Is how I try to run it.
About the nature of evil, as well as call into question the influence of society and culture upon its members. This presents troubling conundrums like, would an orc be evil if he was raised in an environment that taught kindness and mercy while renouncing violence?
See that right there. You can spend a while thinking about that. So in my version, they would still be evil, and they would be kindly renounced, and maybe through discipline they could, you know, not be doing their evil nature constantly, but it would always be there. It would always be part of them.
If evil only destroys, then how can it create a race at all?
So you don't want to do evil only destroys. It's more like it conquers. It's worth noting that. Wait, there's. I'll go into that after that.
If the orcs were once elves twisted into darkness, then could it be possible for them to find redemption
That's Tolkien. I don't worry.
under the right circumstances? How would a society that is utterly evil and dedicated to destruction even function?
So that right there, normally the orcish society falls in on itself, so they end up going into their tribe format, where it's like small groups, very decentralized. I think the Forgotten Realms had a group of orcs where you had the head orc dude that was super tough, and then what he did was he okay, let me. So Forgotten Realms once had, I think it was Forgotten Realms, had a backstory civilization of orcs, where the entire civilization was built by a very powerful half-orc, and could only really maintain because that half-orc was, powerful and capable of organizing them. And then once he died, the orcish civilization collapsed in on itself. And I really like that. So basically the orcs can't really build out into too big without some sort of powerful leader stepping in.
Tolkien himself struggled with these very questions, which is why we are going to completely ignore them. Now let's...
Nothing wrong with ignoring certain things if you don't want to in a D&D game. Never mind. Forget I said that one.
look at halflings. Ditch them. You heard me. Remember what I said earlier about ripping off Tolkien? Well, here is where we ignore that rule and completely remove halflings. Halflings are boring, and they will have no place in our fantasy plot, since our conflict with the Dark Lord will be resolved in a one-on-one duel with a teenager who is secretly the heir to the human kingdom. We can't have meek, ordinary folk actually rise to the occasion and selflessly risk their happy lives to save the world. After all, average people can't accomplish anything, and the fantasy genre certainly wouldn't waste time pandering to those people. Now,
so, when you run Dungeons and Dragons, you are the average people playing the things, and that's part of why the themes don't. So when you play Dungeons and Dragons, you, the players, are already the average people doing the things. So it already is pandering to you, which is part of why halflings just don't fit. So you end up doing some weird things. I remember I saw like a version of halflings where it was like swamp halflings, and I found those pretty cool. But the problem with halflings is they often don't quite, they just don't quite mesh. I think Eberron had some halflings with their with dinosaurs that they rode, and that was a very cool take on halflings. What I would do with them is I would have them they can eat half the food we need to survive. So I would have halflings be like the dominant race that became powerful during like a famine or something. That could be really fun. You could even like twist the demographics. If you have like a 60% halfling population, you could actually really screw over other people because the food is so much more expensive for all the other races. So let's say halflings need 1,000 calories a day, and you have a halfling civilization. They're all producing enough that they can eat fairly cheaply. Then you have a human that walks in, they have to eat double that, and then maybe a Goliath walks in and they have to eat triple that. And maybe adventuring parties are not composed of halflings, literally just because halflings. Let me find my words. Maybe adventuring parties are not composed of halflings, literally just because halflings are able to afford to survive cheaply, and then all the other races can't afford it, and as a result, um, they just don't go on adventures most of the time, and they hang out while other people are desperate for food, so they go on their adventures. I got a little rambly at the end there.
Would it? Why would they need an escapist fantasy? Now we have all the fantasy races
Man, I went really off topic.
we need to populate our very original and creative fantasy world. Some might worry that we stray into unfortunate implications by creating races who have specific abilities, especially when we say that some races, like, say, blonde-haired, blue-eye elves, are better than others. But don't worry, no one calls anyone else a racist on the internet.
I wouldn't worry about that. They're very much biologically distinct within the setting. I did see the official Dungeons and Dragons is moving to the term species. Personally, I like the term demi-human if you really need to change it. But it's inbuilt into the system. You need to either scrap all of them or it's there. You can't keep the fantasy races while removing the implications, which is what they try to do. Which is downright silly most of the time. Anyways.
Is it really just enough to tell an entertaining story? Does a writer have a responsibility to teach a moral as well?
No, you do not. Forced morals. Well, maybe not even forced. Like, there's a tendency to try and shove a moral message into stuff when it really isn't necessary. How do I put it? The point, as I generally see it, is entertainment. It's especially weak when you try to do it into Dungeons and Dragons, because the morality isn't going to be explored properly by your players if you try to stick too many moral implications into stuff. At least with players I've played with. Sorry.
Actually, it's mostly to make money, but it can't hurt to educate the audience too. And by educate, I mean preach to. But what cause should an author take up? There are many problems that plague our rapidly changing modern world. Yet there is one issue that any author can champion without investing time into lengthy and difficult research: environmentalism.
Okay, I know I just said it's not necessary to put morals into your games, but I do really like my cheesy 80s age environmentalism, because it's before it was quite enough to make people groan, and whenever you do the 80s environmentalism, it what's the words? Whenever you do 80s environmentalism, it comes off really cheesy, and that can be very enjoyable as a result. That's it. I like the cheese. I can't figure out the better way of explaining it.
Now, some may mistakenly believe that extensive research helps an author discuss the complex and nuanced issue of environmentalism. Fear not. If it's one thing that Hollywood has shown us, it's that being knowledgeable in the issues one is presenting is completely optional and often counterproductive.
Yeah, that's Hollywood. They really do suck at stuff.
You see, tackling a sensitive and complex problem takes time and effort, both of which we need to avoid at all costs. Now, the great thing about environmentalism is that it can be inserted into any genre, much like high fructose corn syrup is for food. Be sure to shoehorn that theme in no matter how much it doesn't fit. On a fantasy quest to stop a Dark Lord, be sure to completely derail the plot so the resident Wood Elves can teach the protagonist how to be at one with nature.
You do need to build it into the thing. If we go back to the dystopia thing, you can mix the 80s environmentalism with the dystopia or post-apocalypse thing, and you can get some very entertaining stuff because you get the cheesiness and the environmentalism. You want to avoid it being annoying, but you can get some very entertaining things. I'm a big fan of druids in Dungeons and Dragons, so I try to incorporate them into stuff, but I try not to make it. You don't want it to be excessive. I try to make druids more like a faction with a set of goals than a moral group. And that's an important thing to keep in mind.
Exploring the stars? Make sure the crew visits a planet of aliens directly ripped off from Native Americans, and that they learn a valuable lesson on ecology.
Avatar was not a fun movie to watch. Okay, so the thing about Avatar is it's one of the highest grossing movies ever. I watched it for the first time like a week before Avatar 2 came out. I had to split up the watch over like a week of time because it's too long to watch in one sitting. It's just not that good. See, I'm from what I can tell, it was like the CGI was hyper innovative, hyper exciting at the time. The thing is, I've grown up with it came out when I was like 6, and what I've been watching is high CGI just for a while at this point. And then I see Avatars coming out, and I'm like, okay, let's watch that original. It's a classic. And then all of the CGI sucks. Well, it doesn't even suck. It's just the CGI is not impressive. And under the mindset of the CGI isn't that impressive, the only thing to really pay attention to is the writing. And the writing of Avatar is just so dull. Like, supposedly there's a bunch of world building going on, but they don't explain enough of it to really engage me. Apparently, some of it's in, like, some extended cut, but I digress. So, it's just not that good.
Be careful, though, not of shamelessly appropriating Native American culture, but of slowing the story down by exploring the complex alien ecosystem of the planet. A realistic portrayal of an ecosystem would only bore the audience, or at worst, make your Native American...
Okay, so the realistic portrayal of an ecosystem, you can do that with dungeons and monsters and stuff. It takes a lot more thinking and time, but you can get some interesting stuff going on. I don't normally spend too much time on the ecosystem, and I should probably correct that, but you can get some interesting things. I remember I was watching a podcast. It was a D&D podcast, and there was a large monster that was illegal to hunt because it kind of cleared out a lot of predators to kind of keep the environment healthy. It was like a frog or something, like giant frog or something.
American stand-ins appear imperfect. Speaking of realism, avoid showing realistic predator-prey relationships and be sure to only highlight the positive traits of the natural world.
Okay, people do this way too much. They'll be like, "Oh, it's nature," and then they ignore all the bad stuff in nature.
We can't have our moral undermined by Mother Nature herself, who is a powerful and cruel force that lays low even the greatest of mankind's works with a terrible fury. Never mention all of the horrible and nightmarish parasites and apex predators that stalked the world and that drove our ancestors to cower and hide into darkness for fear of being devoured alive. Instead,
So that model right there, I've watched all of these before. That little bit right there has always stuck in my mind a bit. And I really want to run a At War with Druids campaign as a result. I haven't gotten to do it, but like, say we go 2nd edition, because I like 2nd edition. And then we have just an entire group of druids. And then you have this group expanding outwards. And then they build over like a holy land or something. And the druids are like, okay, the only option here, demolish them completely. Like, they go, nope, we can't let any of these people survive. So they surround them. I think it could be a very engaging and, like, think about the terror of the campaign where it's the forces against you, the trees stop bearing fruit to prevent you from feeding, the animals will attack you, even normally passive animals. You have the weather turning against you. And then when they want to attack you, they have all those spells. So they're summoning rats, they're turning into rats, and there's just a swarm of rats attacking the home. It could be a very entertaining campaign, and I just haven't gotten the chance to set up and run it.
instead portray all animals as innocent and kind compared to the evil corporations that plan to bulldoze their happy forests. Now, environmentalism has the added bonus of being easy to make villains for. The most common is the evil corporation. Real-world corporations often use
Okay, evil corporations have a tendency, like, they're not very adaptable to Dungeons and Dragons. You might do them in like Cyberpunk or something. But I remember reading Ready Player One, the book, not the horrible movie. And the corporations in Ready Player One, the big evil one, is just like cartoonishly evil. And I'm not even looking back on it, I'm not even sure what good or service they actually provided to the world. It's just, I mean, I guess it was cheesy. They did the job fine of presenting this like mindless mass against the individualism, but it was just there was something, I don't know. Using megacorps often comes off a little weak.
Short-sighted means that cause environmental harm as a byproduct of their manufacturing processes. But explaining all of that to the audience is boring. So let's make our corporation evil for no reason at all. Have them go out of their way to destroy the environment even if it costs them money. At no point should the evil corporation even consider the massive PR hit they would take by turning pristine...
Yeah. At no point should they consider the massive PR hit. Isn't that right, Wizards of the Coast? But in case this is watched post, this is that there's the OSL. I think it's OSL drama still kind of going on.
Wilderness into a parking lot for a strip mall. Also, be sure that no one in the evil corporation is smart enough to point out that the goods and services provided by the corporation allow them to make a profit and thus employ people and grow the economy. Letting them actually have a reasonable argument would only undermine our own. Although we have an
same thing applies to Ready Player One.
Evil corporation, there must be more we can do to contrast them with the heroes. Why, there is! Our heroes are one with nature, unlike those evil technology-loving corporate stooges. Be sure to give the villains all kinds of advanced technology, from carrier-sized bulldozers to arsenals of advanced weapons and even suits of power armor. Not so subtly suggest that technology is fundamentally evil and bad, unlike our nature-loving heroes. Just be sure to never address the fact that technology empowers individuals, and that finding the perfect balance between nature and civilization will ultimately require a technological solution. Why we can even have our heroes steal the villains' technology and use it against them without acknowledging the obvious irony. With the villains defeated...
Yeah, that's a thing that happens. Yeah, I don't have anything D&D related to add.
In harmony and nature restored, we can safely end the story. There is no need to address that the villainous corporations still exist, and even if they were wiped out, it doesn't remove the hyper-consumer economy that enabled their greed in the first place. Also, do not address that the ignorant consumer is somewhat responsible for tacitly supporting the evil corporations by buying their product. Also, don't address that a consumerist capitalist system requires resources to grow the infrastructure that maintains our very civilization. You know, the one that created the internet that you're watching this video on? However, the biggest pitfall to avoid is actually offering any viable solutions to the problem of environmental destruction. If one must give some kind of alternative, just tell the audience to recycle more something. After all, preaching about environmentalism is not actually about saving the environment, it's all about making the audience feel good about themselves. Well, and also stroking the author's massive ego.
Yeah. Not tons to add there.
Are you itching to tell a fantastic tale about aliens from the distant stars?
Yes, but my players won't let me run Star Frontiers.
Great! Stories featuring aliens have as vast a possibilities as the immenseness of space. But how will our story handle our alien visitors' interactions with humanity? Should we have our spacefaring visitors from beyond the stars come in peace and open a dialogue with humankind? The prospects of peaceful coexistence with alien life.
So I'm thinking about Star Frontiers here. Star Frontiers has a very interesting thing. So what happened was they kind of met, they developed their a trade language, basically, mix of languages that they could talk to each other. And what happened in the Star Frontiers backstory is after a bit, a a alien disease started, and no one had the immune system to deal with it, and it wiped out like 2/3 of the population or something silly. And then right after that, they're like, okay, we're forming a unified government, and and we're and they put in heavy regulations to prevent diseases from spreading ever again. So the unified force was basically a result of disease. That then led into their first contact with the Sathar, which was this alien group that's just actively hostile, and no one's quite sure why. I think it had some elaboration in one of the modules, the one I don't own yet, but they're just there doing stuff. Sathar's fun. So you have the alien invasion, you have the unified force, and some other concepts going on.
Life is a
Also, I really like about Star Frontiers. So space is vast, right? There's this one species in one of the modules, and it was like a slave species of one of the of some. So we're gonna call you Group A, like the players in their civilization, Group A, and then we have Group B, which is this group of creatures on this planet, and then we have Group C, right? So Group B was a slave to Group C, and then Group C needed to drop them off because they were having life support problems. So they just dropped them on this random planet and erased all their memories before they left. And then Group C left. And then Group A, you guys, show up on the planet and meet Group B, who's currently in like a tribal civilization, and they're hanging out. And then Group C is never elaborated on again. So there's just this extra civilization that exists somewhere that you never come into contact with. And I think that's happening, and I like to imagine this happening all the time in Star Frontiers. And there's just this like vast array of thousands and thousands of civilizations that you just haven't met yet. And it's like a really fun concept.
near endless well of potential drama and an opportunity to explore deep themes about the nature of life and existence, which is why it's boring. Instead, let's just have our outer space visitors shoot at humanity with ray guns. That's much more exciting and won't make our audience uncomfortable with unpleasant existential questions. So let's get ready to tell an exciting tale of alien invasion. Just follow my tips and you too can bring humankind to its knees at the heels or alien equivalent of our extraterrestrial.
So what I would do to adapt some of these concepts to Dungeons and Dragons is I would have an invasion from one of the outer planes. Preferably one of the evil ones. So what we could do is we could do an or one of the elemental ones. So what we could do is we could do an invasion from the elemental plane of fire. And we can have that come in, and they're not even necessarily hostile, they're just expanding. But since they're fire, they're destroying everything in the process.
Overlords. Let's get started! Now, some may make the mistake of overthinking the aliens' motivations for invading. This is not as difficult as it sounds. We could just have the aliens invade to steal Earth's natural resources like iron, water, or gold.
So if I needed a natural resource for the aliens to steal, I would probably go for oil. So oil made out of dinosaurs or whatever would be made with carbon and whatnot, and we're a carbon-based society. So you could have them show up and they're stealing the oil specifically. So that even allows them to interact without killing us while still having stuff going on. In Star Frontiers, I remember there's one planet that you're invading. It doesn't have pre-existing intelligent life when you show up. But most of the expansion in Star Frontiers is space mining corporations looking specifically for like uranium and other radioactive minerals, because a lot of stuff's nuclear powered in that setting.
Never mind that all these things can be found in abundance in space, and those don't have a hostile civilization with nuclear weapons defending them.
Always ignore the nukes. Or maybe not even necessarily ignore. You're just normally not available.
Nor should the aliens consider trading some of their technology for natural resources, letting the humans do the work for them without wasting time and energy fighting a war that would likely leave the Earth completely irradiated, rendering any resource gains worthless. Just mention in a throwaway line about how they are after Earth's resources and move on. I'm sure the audience won't question it at all, but why stop there? If we want to make the aliens extra evil, we could have them conquer Earth so they could devour us. Yes, for some reason the aliens want to eat us in spite of deadly biochemical barriers.
So the eating you aliens doesn't work very well, but you can do that a bit better with monsters, because then we can have some magical justification going on. So if we go back to some alien group, let's say the astral plane, and we get our what are they called? Let's say we do astral plane, and we're doing our eldritch monsters, aberrations. Those could actually be feeding off of humans, because you have the Dungeons and Dragons multiverse, so they could be jumping from universe to universe, or version of the material plane to version of the material plane, and eating creatures off there, and maybe they just now got to your plane of existence.
Just make sure they don't discover the wide array of domesticated species that have far more meat on them and that don't have assault rifles. There are many other motivations we can give them as well.
Screw over the cows, your players will hate it.
Well, from using humans as a host for their offspring to attacking Earth for spamming out crappy YouTube videos. But if we can't think of anything, then don't worry. We can just have the aliens invade for no reason at all, and just hint that they have some greater motive. Now,
weirdly, this makes me think of the movie Pixels, where the aliens invade because they got a message from some humans and they mistook it for a declaration of war. That movie was okay. It's more of a comedy, but they justify the alien invasion as well as you could expect for the concept.
now that we have the aliens' mandibles salivating at the prospect of conquering Earth, time for the invasion to begin. Now, being a species powerful enough to bridge the vastness of space would obviously mean that they are highly intelligent, and thus would know the value of gathering
There was a movie where they broke in secretly. What was it called? Let's see. They Live. There was a movie called They Live where they broke in and did all that without starting a hostile war. Very, very exciting action movie. I don't remember how good the plot actually is, but like the action scenes were well made.
Intel on human culture, assessing Earth's international political situation, and analyzing each nation's relative military strength, as well as sending a vanguard to infiltrate major population centers and gather real-time ground intelligence to assist the main invasion force. No doubt the aliens could even use diplomacy to play nation-states against one another, just like historic colonial powers. However, these tactics have two critical weaknesses. The first is that they require the author to actually know something about countries other than America.
No. You could do some interesting stuff with those concepts in D&D. You have, say, mind flayers trying to take over. I don't know, that's all.
The other is that the audience will fall asleep at the words international politics, so make sure the aliens just rush in and start zapping major cities right off without any kind of strategically sound plan. Now, given the advanced state of alien technology, one would assume that they would know to first destroy key military targets, critical logistical infrastructure, and essential communication.
So I'm always wondering how advanced the technology should be. I don't really like over-advancing the technology. I think it would make more sense to have it. They have really advanced space travel technology, but then their actual weaponry is at a much lower point. Also, there was a game, Cyborg Commando. Fun read. It's not available for print anymore. The only way to get it is they find a pirated copy on the internet. But there's nowhere to buy it, and it isn't being sold because the author doesn't want it to not be sold. It's not being sold because they ran out of business. Cyborg Commando, where the aliens invade, and what happens for the alien invasion is humans just have a really rapid technological progression rate compared to other species. And basically the first alien saw the planet at a relatively weak state, was like, all right, we can take over this area pretty quick. I don't remember what their motive was. They wanted to take over Earth. And they're like, okay, so how we want to do this? And they built drones shaped like bugs because humans have an inbuilt fear of bugs. And they just sent bug robots to screw over the humans. And it worked out quite well because, and they showed up, but at the time that they show up, humanity already developed cyborgs, so you get to have this epic bug versus cyborg battles going on. I never got to run the system, but it's a very interesting read.
Hubs. But this is completely wrong. Instead, the aliens should spend all their time destroying historic monuments. Naturally, our military should be completely ineffective at stopping the alien menace. Have our weapons prove useless against the aliens' war machines. Just be sure the army doesn't use any actual tactics and just stands there shooting ineffectively while being cut down by death rays. After a minor skirmish, the armed forces of humanity should instantly throw in the towel without changing tactics. Instead, they should escalate to using nuclear weapons, which, of course, will also prove useless against the aliens' plot shields. Whoops, I mean deflector shields. After the aliens easily defeat our strangely incompetent military forces, humanity will be on the verge of extinction. But don't give up hope yet. We need to give our aliens a weakness. The aliens can be easily defeated by mankind's most powerful weapon, the love triangle. Not even the most powerful alien tech.
So I wouldn't bother with a weakness. I'd instead just scale up the humans to get the technology they need to counteract. Like I said, Star Frontiers, like I said, Cyborg Commando. You have Earth just advance in the time it took the aliens to get there. And in Star Frontiers, you're already a spacefaring civilization when you fight the Cathar. And then you start recovering some technology from the Cathar, and that's where some of the battles start taking place. The Cathar being evil group. Here, real quick. I actually have some miniatures of the Cathar. These are homemade, not available for purchase anywhere. I combined Wargames Atlantic. I combined a couple of their miniatures together. They're like a worm species that's super hostile. Very nice set of villains. Here, maybe I can pull up an image of them. Can that? All right. So that's a Cathar. I guess they're a little scarier in description than appearance. Scarier monsters were scarier in earlier fantasy. Stuff becomes less a big deal the longer stuff exists.
Technology can save a story from being derailed by a love triangle.
I think I accidentally muted my audio.
Little did the aliens know that the power of love can overcome all obstacles. Well, unless the story is targeted at a male demographic, in which case the aliens will succumb to the power of bullets. Just
Perfect. Yes, that is how you should run your D&D game.
Never mention why all of humanity's armed forces prove ineffective at stopping the aliens, while the protagonist manages to destroy legions of alien foes by himself with a crowbar. If one can't think of a weakness, then don't worry about writing yourself into a corner. Alien invasion stories are so easy to resolve that they sometimes resolve themselves. Like having the advanced and highly intelligent aliens forget their inoculations and not invest into antivirus software. Regardless, the humans need to win the day in the end. It is very important that the aliens be completely defeated by a
So I kind of like the concept there. So if you have a alien species that's just a completely unified front, that doesn't really have a lot of internal conflict, they wouldn't actually have protections for a lot of their own stuff. That's all. That's the thought.
Species so stupid they can't even make it to Mars.
Okay, this is urban fantasy. Before we start, I'm thinking of a of Vampire the Masquerade. I remember reading that book, well, part of it, and it's such a long-winded lore dump on how all the urban fantasy stuff works before the book actually starts. And it's like I read it, and at the end I was like, "There's no way I'm gonna convince my players to read this." So I kind of scrapped using it for anything. But I always liked the idea of doing like urban fantasy, but moving it backwards in time a bit. Um, a particularly fun one was like do the vampire thing, but then do it during the Civil War, and I think that could be a very engaging plot. But I never end up saying it up because there's too much front end world building in that system. Uh,
Do you want to make a fantasy world, but are too lazy to build a detailed fantasy setting? Then urban fantasy is the genre for you. Yes, with urban fantasy, we already have a pre-built world ready to go. All we have to do is add magic and bam, instant urban fantasy. It's that easy. Let's get started. Now, given that magic is added into our complex and technologically interconnected modern world, we have to very carefully set up one.
so what was it called? Onward. Onward was a Disney movie where you have the fantasy elves or whatever as their human stand-in, and they live in a modern world, but it's also got a bunch of magic and stuff, and they're like rediscovering magic or whatever. And I remember that one was a very entertaining like movie concept because you had a lot of the magic mixing with the fantasy elements. They were a little lazy on the world building though. They could have done a lot more.
Thing before we work on any other aspect of our story. The love triangle. Yes, the love triangle is the absolute most critical component of any urban fantasy story and will drive even the world building. Now, the biggest decision we have to make is what type of supernatural being our male romantic leads will be. Now, despite them being undead abominations and nocturnal creatures of evil, vampires should be our first choice. Vampires symbolize death and decadence, being a cross between a decaying corpse and a corrupt aristocrat. They are a rotting cadaver.
I remember one of the versions of like what was his name? Strahd? Curse of Strahd? Yes, Curse of Strahd. The Curse of Strahd vampire evil guy Strahd was actually designed to be like an obsessive person concerning um his desired female, and that was his entire character trait that screwed him over for everything else. Um it's a whole thing that's talked about. Um I couldn't go into it in the appropriate detail off the top of my head. I really liked that version of Strahd because he was just kind of, I don't know. Ah.
And a blood-sucking parasite, which of course makes them the perfect romantic interest. Rather than a creature of eternal death, let's make our vampires beautiful. Be sure to give them rock-hard abs despite their undead nature rendering them unable to generate new muscle mass. Be sure they keep their predatory nature and thirst for blood. It gives them a great excuse to angst over their desires to savagely murder the protagonist, who, of course, they are in love with.
I'm remembering, uh, Morbius. Morbius. Liked Morbius. I know a lot of people didn't actually watch it, and there were so many memes, but it was actually a decent like superhero movie. And I remember like the first thing that Morbius does is he like wipes out a number of people, and then he escapes and starts doing his stuff, and he starts eating synthetic blood or blah blah blah. But they almost completely gloss over the like 5 people he kills in the first scene.
Because I know I always struggle to not fall in love with my food. Also, be certain to give our vampires all kinds of awesome powers like incredible speed, super strength, and heightened senses, while also removing all of their weaknesses like sunlight and food seasonings. Just don't bother to address why vampires haven't taken over, despite their obviously superior nature.
I kind of like the concept of an urban fantasy where it's all like you mix the dystopian with the urban fantasy. It's already ruled by monsters, but there's the modern technology going on. So then the dark web's like organizing a resistance. So you have like dwarves, elves, humans, all band together to fight like the vampire Nazis, as is shown there. That could be very fun.
A world ruled by vampires where humans are oppressed into chattel slavery sounds utterly boring. Who would read that? If vampires are not your thing, then we can always use werewolves instead. Unlike the ethereally beautiful vampires, werewolves are gruff with a masculine edge. However, just like vampires, the hunky werewolf must struggle with his true nature to avoid savagely maiming the heroine into bloody viscera.
I don't like werewolves that much. Like, I guess I just haven't seen anything where werewolves are done in a way that I would call good.
How romantic! Now, just like with vampires, we should remove all drawbacks to being a werewolf, as well as get rid of any weaknesses. No need to address that our werewolf would, actually smell like a wolf. However, the most important thing to remember when adding werewolf characters is to never actually read up on wolf physiology and behavior and completely ignore complex pack social dynamics. After all, this is an escapist romantic fantasy, not a biology lesson. Now, if we can't decide between werewolves or vampires, then that's fine. We just add both. But does a story really need a love triangle? Of course not, when we can have a love dodecahedron.
Does
a story really need a love triangle? Of course not, when we can...
Okay, let's take a look at this. I see the alien from the last one, the random dude from the last one. 3 humans, anti-hero, 2 anti-heroes, a superhero, the chick lady, vampire, demon, wolf, fire. You can't see that clearly. Fire hydrant, and an angel, I guess. There's one female here.
Have a love dodecahedron. Not only can we have a vampire and werewolf competing for the affection of the protagonist, but we can also have a normal bad boy alpha male, a hunky wizard, a handsome billionaire who peddles in the occult, a buff government operative, a ripped local detective, an archangel, an incubus, and the list goes on and on until the protagonist's life.
I like the Eldritch Horror thrown in. What did I just do? It's fine.
Is filled with a harem of attractive men. With an army of models pining over our protagonist, we can now detail our main character. This is actually super easy. Just copy our protagonist from the dystopian setting and dress her in leather. Make her a teenage girl with ordinary looks and no discernible personality, but is still inexplicably the setting's chosen one. Rather than local law enforcement, experienced occult societies, or government authorities dealing with the supernatural elements of the setting, it's up to a single teenager to protect the world.
For a case of the kind of urban fantasy that's really good, I would recommend Gargoyles, which is like a cartoon from the 80s, I think. Maybe 90s, not sure. Fantastic cartoon where the protagonists are all gargoyles. And there's an Illuminati going on. There's an Illuminati going on. There's this, there's that, there's the other thing. I can't just this, that, and the other thing explaining a show. There's an Illuminati, there's a rich guy, there's the government, and they're all like kind of interacting with the gargoyles. There's also other supernatural forces, and it's like there's so many things going on, and it nails it perfectly. Yeah.
Of course, don't address that most people won't even trust a teen with a car, much less shouldering the fate of the world. But she can handle it with her vast array of special powers that are vague enough to resolve the plot and break out of whatever corner you write yourself into. Speaking of powers, make sure this is the only way to deal with the supernatural elements of the setting. Have firearms and all forms of modern military weapons be completely useless in stopping our paranormal...
Okay, I don't like that. It's generally there so they have their swords or whatever. But I always do find it annoying when they write out firearms, because guns make sense within the setting. And why shouldn't a gun be able to kill some monsters? Maybe not all of them. Your vampire's already dead. Your werewolf can only be killed by silver, but like silver bullets. Vampire can die to a stake through the heart. I don't see why a bullet shouldn't be able to do equivalent damage. Just why aren't we using these guns in our settings? I remember the Percy Jackson books had like a whole thing about how guns are super unreliable. And then later the author introduced, oh, but if you make guns with this metal, they can be effective. Except wait, they're still they still misfire a lot. And I'm like, dude, why can't I shoot the Minotaur? Why not? Uh Most D&D stuff doesn't have to deal with this because it's ran pre-guns, but sometimes you have some guns thrown in. You get the Renaissance weapons. You see that a lot in certain games. I wouldn't recommend it, generally speaking, but guns are guns.
Foes. This is necessary. Otherwise, normal people might resolve the plot, and we would miss an opportunity to show off how special our protagonist is. Make sure she uses her powers to resolve obstacles, even if this requires our protagonist to appear stupid for not using far more convenient modern technology instead. Also, be certain to ensure all of our setting's magical elements are kept secret from normal people, no matter how much this doesn't make sense.
Harry Potter.
Having a modern world where magic is widely available to the public will require way too much world building, and every page not dedicated to a werewolf-vampire love triangle is a waste of words. Now, I haven't mentioned villains for urban fantasy, because they are barely needed. Just shoehorn them in the last few chapters. No need to put a lot of...
You can make some interesting villains. I'm not sure what I would do. I don't deal with this genre, because I don't like it when the genres are like, oh, here's our isekai, here's our urban fantasy. Like I'd rather it just be completely disconnected most of the time. But you could make some really fun villains if you're like mixing monsters with stuff. Oh, I would probably go for a lich, and then the lich is building up a force of undead. And maybe you have like a lot of these zombies going around, but the zombies are like decent at mimicking human motion. And then maybe you mix in like some other layers, some preservatives, some whatnot, some makeup, and you can make like the zombies mostly seem human, at least on the street. And the lich can like gradually kind of get a large number of the population to be replaced by zombies that he's like remote controlling or da 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 da. And then like have the entire zombie horde like turn on the world, on the city. It just all collapses at once, and then you have these like survivors trying to pick up after it, and they have to figure out how to go back and fight the lich. Sorry, I got distracted. I like liches. They could be fun in this setting.
Thought into them when we should instead keep our focus on resolving the love triangle. Just have our protagonist wipe out the villains as an afterthought, then put even less effort into tying up the romantic loose ends. Easy! Now some of you may say what I have just described is not the genre of urban fantasy, but paranormal romance, and that many urban fantasy novels do detail their settings and magic systems. So go ahead and indulge in world building at the cost of romance, unless you want to make money. It's almost Halloween, so what better way to celebrate this godless pagan holiday than to write a horror story?
Sorry. Good thing.
It's almost Halloween, so what better way to celebrate this godless pagan holiday than to write a horror story? But what genre of horror to cover? Why, there's only one type of horror fiction so formulaic that any idiot can write it with nearly zero effort. A slasher film.
So it's hard to do slasher stuff in D&D. But what you need to do is you need to build up dread. I made a video a while back. I don't know how good it is now. I haven't seen it in a while. Let's talk about building tension in D&D. So what you have to do is you have to like introduce the elements gradually, and it's actually a lot more difficult once you throw in the wild card of players being able to do whatever they want. But I remember once I played Call of Cthulhu online, and the party split up while searching an area. And my character walked into the basement, and the door shut behind me, and I was alone. And that was like, there was a lot of tension going on there. And then the guy moved, and I immediately ran off. I was very cowardly in that game.
Now, one would think the focus of a slasher film is
Like a corpse moved.
the slasher himself, but this is completely wrong. The first slasher film in a franchise is always about the collection of easily murdered stock characters and their petty teenage dramas. This is to save on makeup and special effects, while also serving the dual purpose of wearing the audience's patience thin, so they will not feel guilty about rooting for each team's gruesome death. Now make sure each team...
So right here he does the kind of stock character thing. What I would like to add is I don't hate stock characters. So particularly if I'm running D&D and I need to introduce a character, while I can do a fully developed character and that can be valuable, if you have a stock character, people already know what to expect of the stock character. Which means in the context of D&D where I'm not going too hard into engaging realistic story and I'm going into I need to get them to a dungeon so we can have fun fighting a dungeon. The noble who just wants to hire them to go wipe out the dungeon, I don't need to make him that invested. I really like stock characters. And then once you have a stock character, you can develop on top of that. I remember, you'll notice if you watch sitcoms much, that a lot of the characters start as very stock characters and then they develop over the course of several seasons.
has only one discernible character trait and 0 self-preservation instincts. These traits range from promiscuity to drug addiction and are generally hedonistic. The only exception should be our obviously going to survive main heroine, whose wholesome values will render her immune to the slasher's killing spree, unlike the other characters and their amoral pragmatism. Now that we have our collection of doomed stock characters, we need to pick a setting. Anywhere isolated will do, so long as there's limited cell phone service and all of the motor vehicles have mysterious mechanical failure.
So I would like more slasher films to take place in different settings. If you did like a Civil War age slasher film, that would be very engaging. On the context of D&D, we have it taking place in presumably a medieval fantasy setting. And you can do some fun stuff with that. The main thing is it gets harder to build tension when you're supposed to fight the monster. That's why Call of Cthulhu works really well. You got the 1920s, I think it was, and in the 1920s, you remove all the cell phone service and whatnot, and then you have these monsters, and then you're not really capable of hitting back as hard, and that leans into the horror much better.
Just make sure our victims can't call for help and have those pesky authority figures sort everything out. If our team victims use any of the hundreds of ways to easily send out a call for help, then our movie will be over faster than you can say SWAT team. With the
Not necessarily, you just need to make the monster able to deal with these things. So in Eldritch Horror, for example, you can normally have a Eldritch Horror kill a lot of the creatures.
hedonistic youths trapped, it's time to start the slaughter. After the first victim is killed, the remaining survivors will find a secure location to fortify until help can arrive and will stay close to one another to take advantage of their numerical superiority. Just kidding. They will split up so the killer can butcher them one or two at a time.
Random note, I don't hate splitting up. Splitting up sometimes is a pretty good thing in D&D. The problem is people get really upset about splitting up. And it becomes a whole thing. But it's really, it's not that bad of a thing to, send a rogue to scout ahead for a little bit, as long as the rogue's able to run away. Yeah.
Time. Be sure to make their deaths as graphic as possible to sate the bloodthirst of not the slasher, but the audience, who's watching this movie to revel in the death of their fellow man. Now, slasher...
One moment. Sorry, needed to do a thing. There we go.
are all about style. They could use firearms, but that's boringly efficient. Instead, they should use a common tool of some kind that...
Okay, so for fantasy, I actually would recommend making a really interesting magical means of death. Think about it this way. Pretend for a second we get a slasher we do a slasher format in a medieval fantasy, and we use, say, I don't know, Ravenloft or something to get the right mix of power and stuff. And none of this works in It generally doesn't work that well in 5th edition. I wouldn't recommend 5th edition for any of this. But well, let's say we want to do our medieval fantasy slasher session. Uh, Picture a guy that can just channel lightning into punches. Like, that alone could be a pretty brutal way of killing characters. I'd also recommend axes. Axes are fun.
Would probably break down if someone tried to use it as a weapon. Some slashers have a supernatural ability to stop their chainsaws from dying. Nor should a slasher suffer the indignity of actually chasing their prey. Slashers do not run, they saunter. Don't worry, another supernatural slasher ability is to fold space so they can appear when least expected to deal the killing blow. This jump scare teleportation does not work on the main character though, as her purity cancels.
Okay, I don't like the teleportation. I like it when the distances can be easily followed. There was a Andor the series. I remember it was really good because you had the first arc. It was like the first 3 episodes. You have 2 episodes of setup. It's a little slow paced, and then you have the 3rd episode. And what's fun about the 3rd episode is you can like track everything, including the villains' positions and stuff, throughout the entire episode, and it's actually fantastic. And like, I like being able to follow what the villains are doing while the heroes are doing something at the same time. So in Dungeons and Dragons, I try to like track where the villains are on like a hidden map or something to see how that reflects into what's going on. The villains have very consistent rules that they have to follow.
It out. Now, one of the best things about slasher films is the time a writer saves on dialogue, since the slasher never speaks. If not, then that's okay. Give the slasher all kinds of cheesy one-liners instead. I'm sure those won't get old. After all of the other characters are dead, the final girl will face off against our slasher and somehow defeat him despite being physically weaker, shorter without a long reach, having less endurance, lacking upper body strength, remaining completely unarmed, and without any supernatural powers of her own. The slasher is defeated for good, or at least until the teaser just before the credits roll. With the first movie out of the way, we can now flesh out our slasher in the sequel films.
Alright, I don't like sequels a lot. Sequels have a tendency to have problems if they aren't like planned from the beginning. That's all.
As a general rule, keep escalating every aspect of the slasher. Each film in the series should see the slasher gain new powers, more victims, and even cheesier one-liners. Don't forget to dilute the very things that made the slasher interesting in the first place, and keep lumping on new gimmicks that become increasingly silly as each sequel progresses. By the time the 3rd film rolls around,
I'm thinking about the liches again. Imagine like a lich, and like each session you keep adding on a gimmick. At the end, you have like a lich with a phantom yo-yo strangling people to death.
our slasher should look almost nothing like the original. I'm sure it won't alienate old fans of the franchise. Gradually shift the focus of the movie to the slasher and glamorize him while completely ignoring the fact that he is a mass murderer. Now, eventually, we will run out of gimmicks. That's okay. Just send our slasher into space. When we can't think of new plots, we can always insert our slashers into new genres. If that fails, then we can always reboot it with somehow worse special effects. With these tips, our slasher franchise can become unkillable as the slasher himself, because the only thing that can truly defeat a slasher is poor box office returns.
Yeah, he does a lot of movie references. Okay, so this is the Star Wars episode. Don't run Star Wars in D&D. So the problem with Star Wars, and So if I wanted to run Star Wars, what I would do is I would take the original trilogy. I'd say 1, 2, and 3 are uncanon, 7, 8, and 9 are uncanon. We just have the original trilogy for reference. And I'd have it take place maybe a decade, 2 decades after, and yeah, blah 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 happening. And the reason for this is the world building of Star Wars and the rules of the mechanics are wildly inconsistent the longer the franchise goes on. So if we use 1, 2, and 3, for example, the Jedis get a lot more powers and we need to follow that. And then we add 7, 8, and 9, the amount of extra stuff that doesn't make sense and is weird really goes out of hand. So if I ever want to run sci-fi, I would run Star Frontiers. I've talked about it already in this video. 80s system sci-fi, and what's fun about that is even though there's like some light fantasy elements, it all takes place like within a very easy to follow set of rules, while you don't really have much of that in Star Wars. Like, if we use hyperdrive, for instance, I can look to that one and I can say, all right, here's exactly how long it takes you to get here. If I'm running Star Wars, hypothetically, I don't know where I'm going. Just gonna So there is stuff to learn from the text scroll of Star Wars. The first text scroll of Star Wars, like Episode 4, it's a very dense bit of exposition. And I really always liked it because you have the exposition layered so densely that you can easily follow everything that's going on and use it to you have like a strong set for what's going on. So the thing about D&D is there's a lot of upfront world building that you sometimes have to go through, and you always want to keep that Stars format where you have like 2 paragraphs of very dense exposition to give to your players, because you don't want to make it take too long.
Do you want to write a Star Wars story? It is your destiny. I will guide you in the ways of Star Wars style storytelling, my young apprentice. Let us begin with a transition screen wipe. Now, Star Wars plots range from insultingly simple to unnecessarily complicated. However, since the Star Wars franchise is now owned by a huge corporation, the only option is to abandon any attempt at innovation and stick to what works. This means that any new Star Wars plots should resemble something from episodes 4, 5, or 6. This makes things easy since we only have 2 possible plots.
So they do a lot of imitation, but a lot of the imitation doesn't come with the same context. I don't really want to elaborate on it too hard here. There's this YouTuber called Mauler. Did great in detail dives into episode 7 and episode 8.
Evil Empire builds superweapon, or Evil Empire chases princess. Don't worry about having to choose between them when we can have both. Now, some may point out that the Empire is foolish for building superweapons, since every Death Star and Starkiller base build has yet to survive even a single battle. Never mind they could build enough nuclear missiles to...
So we ignore nuclear missiles for the purposes of Star Wars. Okay. So we ignore nuclear missiles for the purposes of Star Wars. That said, I do remember episode 9 had the downright silly reveal of an entire fleet of planet killers.
Sterilize every planet in the galaxy at a fraction of the cost of a single Death Star. So let's just ignore this fact, just like the Empire does. With our plot under...
Well, here's where I would go for internal consistency over logic a little bit. So as long as we're internally consistent, I don't mind this as much. So let's say we're just ignoring nukes for the purposes of our science fiction game. That's fine as long as we don't introduce nukes later. A good example of why I really don't like it in Star Wars is you will have these like elements that are like neat and it's fine, but then we introduce other elements later that contradict it. So let's use, for example, why don't the main characters ever use a shield in the original trilogy? It's because there's no shields, no biggie, we can ignore it. But then we introduce shields in episode 1, and then we introduce those full shields that the battle droids get. Not the battle droids, but the I forgot what that specific type of battle droid was called. And it's like, okay, so those clearly exist. Why don't we have them over here? And that's what happens when you keep building on top of something without keeping in what happens before.
we need a setting. Since Star Wars takes place in a massive galaxy full of possibilities, we have a huge amount of creative freedom. Just kidding. Let's stick with what's safe, and what's safe is simply revisiting planets from episodes 4, 5, and 6. We don't want to get out of the fans' comfort zone while ruthlessly exploiting their nostalgia. If one is feeling creative, then it
The potential of the thousands of planets of sci-fi should never really be forgotten. One of my favorite things to do is like look at like day-night cycle being screwed with. So there's this one thing in one of the Star Frontiers books where the entire planet, like, it has the day-night cycle. How do I explain it? And yes, I do talk about Star Frontiers a lot. It's a really nice system and setting. But there's one where the entire planet is flipping between, is like rotating, and it takes like a year for it to complete a single day's revolution. So functionally, the dark side's, no, it takes an entire month for one revolution. So essentially, the dark side's winter, the light side's spring, and all the animals are migrating one way, while all the plants kind of go into this frozen state whenever they're on the other side. And it was really interesting. I I should just do a Star Frontiers stream.
It is okay to make a new planet, but it has to adhere to one critical rule. Planets in the Star Wars universe have only one biome.
So the thing about the biome concept, like, I get it, but also you need to keep stuff in mind. So if we do our ice planet and desert planet, for example, those make plenty of sense because an entire planet being cold as an ecosystem kind of works out as it's just far away from the sun. And the same thing with the desert planet, it's just close to the sun or there's not a ton of water, yada yada. Water planet even makes sense to some degree because there's just a ton of water. But then you get like the forest moon, and that doesn't make a ton of sense because there would be more variation if we're in a state like that. Well, I do tend to do the biome models, but it's worth thinking about.
It is important to ignore the only current model we have for life-bearing planets, Earth, with its biodiversity, variety of environmental conditions, and numerous binomes. I have a bad feeling about this, is what any writer would say, but don't worry, we just need to stick with the main theme of Star Wars. On first glance, the themes of Star Wars seem obvious. The mystery and power of the Force and how it binds all living things together in harmony, how it guides us, but also has a dark side that feeds upon negative emotions, symbolically standing in for the yin-yang nature of good and evil. Then there is the ever-present theme of nature triumphing over technology, like how Luke only makes the shot on the Death Star exhaust port by ignoring the targeting computer, or how the supremely technologically powerful Empire is defeated by...
Okay, note on that one. Those were originally Wookiees, and then they swapped it for Ewoks to sell toys, and I'm still mad about that.
Teddy bears with sticks, not to mention all of the thematic allusions to the hero's journey monomyth. However, all of this is completely wrong. Star Wars has only one true theme that dominates every work within its universe. Merchandising! Every Star Wars film must include new droids, ships, and characters that can easily be turned into action figures. And that
The droids is becoming more and more annoying because they go for like bigger, more deadly droids every time, but it's like, eh. Like I remember there's the commando droids that are super deadly and whatnot. And it's not clear why they don't make an entire army of the commando droids. They were just introduced to be added and they didn't think about the implications.
That's just the beginning. Then there is the tie-in books, audio plays,
Okay, I don't know what the audio play is. I read that tie-in book. The Aftermath series isn't bad, but the thing is every time they do more Star Wars, they keep kind of messing some stuff up. Aftermath is pretty good. I remember they had a couple it was like I forgot what they were called. They'd take little breaks from the plot to talk about what characters are up to during this time. I remember the Aftermath book confirmed that Jar Jar canonically becomes a clown after episode 6. Not a joke. Jar Jar canonically becomes a clown. Chewbacca also canonically has a son who hasn't been brought up, And that was also where they introduced the what was the character called? In The Mandalorian, they had our Western character with the Mandalorian with the that had Boba Fett's armor for a bit. The Marshal. The Marshal was his name. He was actually introduced in the Aftermath book before he got added to the Mandalorian. So I think all those like all the interludes, that's what they were called, were supposed to be setting up stuff that they do later, and then they ended up scrapping a bunch of it. Though I could be wrong. Additionally, I tried watching Rebels. Not that good.
Television series and comics, not to mention all the video games, shirts, coffee mugs, posters.
I love a good Star Wars video game. Why? I never noticed that before. What? That's a thing?
And, specialized dolls. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's finish the story first. This shouldn't take too long. Just stick to one or both plots I mentioned earlier. Don't worry about plot holes. We can just fill those in with the Force. Easy.
I hate that. You want to minimize the plot holes. Sometimes you can't do that much for a Dungeons and Dragons game. Sometimes there's just plot holes, but you want to mitigate impact as much as possible. Stick with consistency. That's where you get the most engaging stories.
After we have slapped together the plot, we need to write dialogue. I don't like Star Wars dialogue. It's coarse and rough and irritating, and it gets everywhere. But don't worry.
So the dialogue varies a lot. There's nothing D&D related to the dialogue. Episodes 4, 5, and 6 were mostly okay. Episodes 1, 2, and 3 are really interesting because they have dialogue that's almost good, but then screws up. It's just not quite human while you can tell what they're going for. I remember episode 7 actually had some decent dialogue between Rey and Han Solo for a bit there. They didn't specialize as much as they didn't spend as much time on the characters as they should, but it had some good dialogue, which I really liked. I need to check that. Not important.
You have the high ground. You have the power. Unlimited power. To not worry about the dialogue at all, since I'm sure the editor and director will ignore it and edit in more action scenes instead. It's almost like the writing is treated as the least important part of a Star Wars movie. And that's the kind of attitude a writer needs to write a Star Wars story.
I'm sorry, J.P. Bobian. It seems in your rush to get this video out that you have forgotten one important Star Wars cliché. No!
Alright, that's as much time as I can devote to binging a stream no one's watching. If anyone's watching this after it goes out, props to you for listening to my idiotic ramblings. Please stick around. Let me